Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue our reading of The American Slave Coast by Ned and Constance Sublety. We're on chapter 30, A Jog of the Elbow, which starts with a quote from Nicholas Biddle written in 1823. He said, "While the bank is my goddess, its desks are my altars, and all my fine frenzy is spent on defaulters." The war was over, and at last Britain was respecting the American flag at sea. Money was flowing, albeit along unprecedented and unpredictable courses. No energy was being consumed in partisan warfare. The Federalists had all but disappeared as a political force. Jackson didn't only crush the Creeks, his victory at New Orleans gave the coup de grace to the disgraced Federalist Party members, of which had been threatening New England's secession since 1793 and had openly sided with Britain during the conflict. For the first time since the early days of the Washington administration, there was only one functional party in the United States. At its head was Jefferson's former law student, James Monroe, who as a teenager had crossed the Delaware with Washington and as an adult had taken credit for the Louisiana Purchase. It was Monroe who dispatched Jackson into New Orleans, and he came into peacetime as a national hero. Facing no serious opposition in the presidential election of 1816, he became the third consecutive president from the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. After the extreme partisan battles during what some historians describe as the first party system, the relative political tranquility of a one party nation led to a derriere garde New England Federalist newspaper editor in 1817 to coin the sarcastic phrase, the era of good feelings, a term that passed into general retrospective use by identifying Monroe's first, but not the second, presidential term. It was an era especially of good feelings for all those connected to the fast growing commercial web spun out of cotton. Monroe is the only U.S. president to have an African capital city named after him, Monrovia, in Liberia, a country whose name betrays its intention as a destination of exile for manumitted ex slaves. The American Colonial Society, which proposed to implement the self deportation of free African Americans, was co founded by Francis Scott Key 2 years after he published Defense of Fort McHenry, which, as we know, is the Star Spangled Banner. Over the years, a plethora of famous political names attached themselves to the society, including James Madison, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John Randolph, Andrew Jackson, and even Abraham Lincoln. The chimera of colonization, the white dream of mass Black deportation that would comply with the vision Jefferson had projected in Notes on the State of Virginia, lasted until secession. Disclaiming any connections with abolitionism, it was a way of doing nothing about slavery. John Quincy Adams flatly called the society a fraudulent charitable institution. And that's because they didn't want to stop slavery. They wanted to stop enslaved people from thinking free thoughts. The word colonization implied that African Americans would somehow establish American colonies, which would have meant freeing slaves to go establish foreign beachheads for the slave masters. The idea was widely hated by free Black people who were subject to various odious restrictions, but for the most part had no intention of leaving their homes. And some 3,000 people of color assembled at Mother Bethel in 1817 to protest the formation of the society. Harriet Martineau, who in 1834 visited James Madison in retirement at his Montpelier plantation a week after he had sold a dozen of his slaves, wrote that he accounted for selling his slaves by mentioning their horror of going to Liberia, a horror which he admitted to be prevalent among the Blacks. The idea of colonization was hated just as much by hard slavery Southerners who saw it as soft on abolitionism and tending toward keeping a smaller portion of the population enslaved when what they wanted was to see as much of the population enslaved as possible. So see, they never intended to set us free. They wanted us to go to Liberia and start American colonies in Liberia to further slavery. The party of Jefferson and Madison had discovered the uses of executive power, shifting it considerably from its radical anti-federal stance of the first years of the Republic. As they began rebuilding the White House and the Capitol, the Republicans saw how the federal government as a functional entity to enable the internal improvements that the fast growing nation needed. A reliable paper money was needed, and the government needed a fiscal agent to support its wartime debt, much of it owed to foreign financiers. To that end, the Second Bank of the United States was chartered for 20 years, as the first had been in 1817. Much of its capital stock was drawn not from its shareholders' gold and silver, but from their holdings of public debt. The bank was also heavily invested in British bills of exchange. With the War of 1812 over, ship owners had surplus privateering or pirating boats to sell. But besides privateering or pirating, these fast maneuverable vessels were also in use by slave traders who bought used privateers and commissioned new vessels as well. Baltimore style clippers made in Baltimore and many other places as well would be the vessel of choice for an African slave trade that no longer came to the United States, but would still carry perhaps more than 1 million kidnapped Africans to Cuba and Brazil. The misery of the experience would have been heightened by the boat's characteristics. Being light and fast made for even worse seasickness. This era of the slave trade was notorious for its tight packing, the tiny below decks compartments were typically only 3 feet high or so. So when the captives were put away at night, they rode lying down, packed tightly together. And since clippers rode wet, taking on large quantities of seawater, they were often cold and damp. When the Chesapeake unblockaded, coastwise vessels could freely ply the route from Baltimore to New Orleans. Those cash for Negroes advertisements began appearing in newspapers around the Chesapeake as of 1815. But it was a slow expansion at first because the Second Bank of the United States tightened credit in 1818. South Carolina's Langdon Cheves, who had been a war hawk and who killed the first bank in Congress, was named the second bank's director in March of 1819. On the question of the balance of credit versus metal, Sheaves was all the way at the hard money end of the scale. He was in favor of lavish personal spending coupled with extreme governmental restraint, and he was against the very concept of fractional reserves, the basis of modern day banking. He continued tightening credit, accumulating government income in the form of inert specie while refusing to extend loans against it. That drove the Panic of 1819 into a depression the following year, during which he continued his extremely conservative management while many were ruined. Under his stewardship, the bank required each of its branches to make their own decisions with the capital with which they were allotted. By the time he resigned, Sheaves had, in Howard Bordenhorn's words, effectively taken a national organization and transformed it into a network of independent banks operating under the loose direction of a parent institution in Philadelphia. The result was an uncoordinated interregional cash flow and a differential of exchange rates from region to region, not a good basis for national commerce. Sheaves resigned in 1822, proud of the soundness of his overcapitalized bank, and was replaced by board member Nicholas Biddle in January 1823, whose quote we heard at the beginning of this chapter. Biddle, who in a poem he wrote at a lady's request shortly after he was named director, sang the praises of that simplest, sublimest of truths, 6%, began letting credit out again and organized specie shipments. Precious metal could be purchased like any other commodity, and Biddle brought in shiploads of silver from Mexico, now independent from Spain and more tractable. The silver entered the bank's system at its New Orleans branch as New Orleans entered into its peak era of national influence. Biddle created a domestic exchange operation that could make capital easily mobile throughout the country with a national currency supplied by him that was worth the same amount at any of the bank's national branches. So he nationalized money and he got the money system back on board and aligned to itself instead of having different rates of exchange in different places. The appropriation of the Creek lands was a textbook case of accumulation by dispossession. Now, the formation of a new capital class could begin, with confiscated lands as the basis of new wealth, if enough slave labor was available to clear it and make it produce. So they took away the land of the Native Americans, dispossessed them, stuck them on reservations, and then they imported more slaves so that they had people to work the land. Alabama's liberation for slavery set off great land rush remembered as Alabama fever. The U.S. Land Office did land office business, privatizing the newly available territory taken from the Native Americans and handing out the land in vast quantities on liberal credit terms. For slave traders, the takeover of Alabama by the Cotton Kingdom was the beginning of a long boom. Cotton was a different kind of crop from tobacco or rice, and its cultivation imposed a different kind of brutality on its labors. The whip driven regime of cotton was nothing known to Virginia. Tobacco cultivation was artisanship by comparison. Rice cultivation was task labor in which individual workers had specific, differentiated tasks to attend to. But cotton was based on the uniform, infinite repetition of the same tasks, requiring much of the way in the way of manual dexterity and endurance. The society of the enslaved of the Cotton Kingdom was a far cry from the family structures that still existed in Virginia and Maryland. The plantation population that worked the cotton fields were isolated remnants of destroyed families, jumbled together like the prison population they were. So, what he's saying is that other forms of crops like tobacco and rice were not as harsh on the enslaved people as was cotton. In the first years of the boom, about a third of them came from Mississippi or Maryland, but they also came from Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, and increasingly points south. The arrival of so many occasioned a new cultural collision among the enslaved, as Black, English speaking former Marylanders found themselves having to converse with Gullah speakers from the Low Country or French speakers from Louisiana. And of course, until 1820 or so, there were still some Africans coming in via piracy. Some farmers left their played out farms and set out for Alabama with their slaves. Others went to market to buy as many slaves as they could get. Some planters traveled north to the Chesapeake, hoping to get better prices by buying slaves directly from planters who were selling. Others formed small partnerships to travel around on buying trips, placing newspaper ads, visiting planters, and attending auctions. They found eager vendors on the eastern shore of Maryland, where Easton began an annual slave auction in 1818, selling off its surplus of young farm hands away from their families for the convenience of the Alabama fevered. Even here, he's saying that it wasn't until the introduction of cotton that they divided up families, but they always divided up families. Never let them tell you that propaganda that they let the families stay together. They didn't. They sold us away in parcels, piece by piece, to the highest bidder. States farther north got in on the action. New York and New Jersey both still had slavery in 1819, and slave owners in both states took advantage of the opportunity to sell slaves to Alabama. The numbers were nothing like Southern numbers, of course. The 1820 census showed 7,557 slaves in New York out of a population of 277,575. And by 1830, the slave count was down to 2,254. Most of the diminution was from manumission, but some hundreds of enslaved people in eastern New Jersey were trafficked down south. By the state's act of gradual abolition in effect since 1804, they were supposed to give their consent to leave the state, but that consent was easily forged. The message was heard all through those states that still permitted slavery. Raising slaves was a good business. Florida, the prize that had eluded Monroe at the time of the Louisiana Purchase, was at last within reach. Spanish forces were stretching thin, engaged as they were failing to suppress the independence wars being held in South America by Simon Bolivar and Jose de San Martin. Monroe sent an eager Jackson to march some 5,000 men into Spanish East Florida in 1818 in a de facto declaration of war on Spain without congressional consent. The expressed aim of Jackson's invasion was to stop Native American terrorists, or the Black Seminoles, from making any more raids into the U.S. territory. Though the skirmishes had been bidirectional, the Georgians also raiding into Florida for livestock and slaves. Jackson's Florida campaign was overtly a war on free Black and indigenous people, the Black Seminoles. His report of it made repeated reference to the enemy as Indians and Negroes by saying, to chastise a savage foe who, combined with the lawless band of Negro brigands, have for some time past been carrying on a cruel and unprovoked war against the citizens of the United States. They made themselves the victim. Has compelled the president to direct me to march my army into Florida. I have penetrated into the Muskogee towns and reduced them to ashes. Earlier, we have spoken of the concept of an ongoing guerrilla war. This was one of the major hostilities of its long course. Jackson's marauders burned hundreds of houses, destroyed forts, killed an unknown number of Native Americans, and hung two Native American leaders in front of their own people. Jackson almost started another war with Britain by executing two British subjects in front of the Black and Native populations, impressing on them that they could not look to Britain for an alliance. The Englishman, Alexander Arbuthnot, who had accurately warned that the Seminole chief, who had accurately warned the Seminole chief, Billy Bowlegs, that the main drift of the Americans is to destroy the Black populations of the Suwannee, was hanged from the yardarm of his own schooner, while the Scotsman, Robert C. Armbruster, was shot by firing squad. So they were at all costs trying to annihilate any hope of freedom in the minds of these Black people. They were, Jackson wrote, exciters of this savage, in other words, Native American and Negro war, legally condemned and most justly punished. Jackson was burning to go on to Cuba, where there were no Indians but many Africans. Security of maritime commerce was not fully assured. He insisted until Cuba was under the control of the United States. I will assure you Cuba in a few days, he promised Monroe, if given the necessary support. So he wanted to go and take over Cuba as well. Monroe was alarmed by the international implications of Jackson's aggression in Florida, though he wanted the territory. Secretary of War John C. Calhoun liked the idea of taking Cuba, but not of the war with Spain that it would entail, and denied Jackson the forces to continue. Calhoun was apparently also afraid that Jackson's military ambitions might be Napoleonic and that he would take over the civil government. He attacked Jackson in the closed meetings of the cabinet, demanding that Monroe censure him, though Jackson only learned about that years later when Calhoun was his vice president. The only member of the cabinet to defend Jackson's actions was Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who was no less than Monroe saw Florida as essential to national security. Adams who was far and away the most experienced diplomat of the time, proceeded to negotiate Jackson's win against Spain to an annexationist conclusion that resulted in major territorial gains for the United States. The Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 ceded East Florida to the United States and ended lingering controversies about West Florida. It also promised that the United States would not try to annex Texas. Adams perhaps believed to be a keepable promise, but Jackson certainly did not. The treaty also ceded Spain's claim to Oregon to the United States, extending the border to the West Coast in a joint occupation with Great Britain, whose Hudson Bay Company competed with John Jacob Astor's company for the fur trade there. Mississippi was yet sparsely populated by white people, and with the Natchez, its largest city, became a state in 1819. Most of it was still Choctaw or Chickasaw land, and there was a popular discontent from Georgia westward about the slowness of the process of Indian removal. In 1820, Calhoun called in Andrew Jackson, a firm believer in deportation of Native Americans, together with Thomas Hines, a Mississippi veteran of the Creek War, to negotiate. More like arm twist, the Treaty of Doak's Stand with Jackson's former ally, the Choctaw chief Pushmataha, which conveyed Choctaw land to the United States with a chunk of land beyond the Mississippi River ceded to them in return, or given to them in return. In practice, the Choctaw were unwilling to remove themselves, and it took until the late 1830s, with Jackson as president, for their forced exile from the state of Mississippi to be accomplished. Memphis was developed into a town in 1819 by former Tennessee Superior Court Judge John Overton, who would become for a time the richest man in Tennessee. Incorporated in 1826, it quickly became the regional distribution hub for large areas of Mississippi, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Missouri. As a slave trade center that serviced the new plantations of the large, fertile region, it boasted Mississippi River connections to Natchez and New Orleans. Grateful to Andrew Jackson, the politicians of Mississippi in 1821 named their newly created capital city for him. Located on the bluffs overlooking the Pearl River, at the site of the trading post stop on the Natchez Trace, the town of Jackson connected by water to New Orleans via Lake Pontchartrain. Unfortunately, it wasn't easy to get to and from Jackson. The governing elite of Natchez, which was the only important commercial center in Mississippi at the time, blocked international improvements that would have removed the sunken logs that booby-trapped the Pearl River, which was, said Senator Thomas Buck Reed in 1826, useless to the inhabitants, or nearly so, from the want of resources in the state to adapt it for the purposes of commerce. Roads were rudimentary. Spain's empire continued to deteriorate. Mexico became independent in 1821, which is the same year the Spanish evacuated St. Augustine for the second and last time, pursuant to the Adams-Onis Treaty. The combat adverse Thomas Jefferson could not have imagined a less likely figure than Andrew Jackson to realize his dream of snatching the Floridas. Jackson had done it not by ensnaring the Indians in debt as Jefferson had imagined, but by forcibly evicting them, even as he fought a war of repression against the free Black people who lived among them. With that same stroke, he accomplished the Carolinian dream. Now there was no free territory to the South that the enslaved of South Carolina and Georgia could escape to or organize insurrections from. So Dr. Claude Anderson often talks about the fact that Black people ran away to the South. And what these authors are saying is that during this time, after 1821, it was impossible for Black people to run away to the free South because there were no more free Southern states. Because Andrew Jackson, President Andrew Jackson, warmonger, nasty tempered, the ill tempered Andrew Jackson, actually made sure that he expanded the slave states of Florida because he had aught against the Indians and aught against the free Africans that had run away there and the maroon communities that existed there. The South had been made safe for plantation slavery. There was no more Native American threat, no more maroon havens, no more Spanish, no more British. It took longer It no longer needed the protection of the United States from enemies south and west. South Carolina could now afford to become even more uncooperative with the federal government. Greetings, KW Don 7. Thanks so much for tuning in. We're on page 412 of of the American Slave Coast. The subheading is the Star Spangled Slave Trade, and section is titled A Jog of the Elbow. Monroe sent Jackson to install the Florida state government, but he resigned after only 9.5 months in St. Augustine amid complaints of dictatorial behavior and went back to Tennessee to become a senator. The Americans built a new town near the site of the long disappeared Huguenot community of Fort Caroline and called it what else? Jacksonville. Sectional politics resulted in one of the nation's historic political struggles fought in 1819 to 1820 over whether the sparsely populated territory of Missouri, acquired as part of the Louisiana Purchase and previously a slave territory under the French and Spanish, could be admitted to the Union as a free or slave state. The prize at stake was control of the Senate, which was crucial for slaveholders. The House was now coming under the control of the North because, in terms of population, the North was handily outpopulating the South through immigration. It had already stripped the 3/5 constitutional advantage, and the gap was widening. Another prize was the concession to sell slaves to Missouri pioneers. Needless to say, Virginia was enthusiastically in favor of Missouri's annexation as a slave state. Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky began earning his nickname of the Great Compromiser, which was not a compliment in South Carolina, by leading through Congress the Missouri Compromise, which admitted Missouri with slavery to the Union of the 24th state in 1821. In exchange, Maine was detached from Massachusetts and admitted as the 23rd state, thus maintaining the Senate in a stalemate. But as part of the compromise, slavery was outlawed west of Mississippi and north of the 36-degree, 30-minute latitude. The planter class of South Carolina, who could not expand their system into the West without slaves, was outraged. This, they shouted, was federal overreach. So they were mad because they couldn't expand slavery out to the West Coast. Frederick Bancroft wrote that slave owners had not previously believed that their chief interest was in danger. The far seeing were now convinced of this. The whole South was sure to be permanently sectionalized if the political anti slavery North ever became thoroughly organized. The political strength of the North depended on the development and interest and the extent to which the prejudices and fears could be excited. Formerly, sectionalism had usually been mild and courteous. Henceforth, it was rarely to be either mild or courteous. Missouri had been acquired as part of the Louisiana Territory by Jefferson, who in his retirement saw what would happen. His remark in a letter of April 22nd, 1820 to John Holmes of Maine is well known, saying, "A geographical line coinciding with a marked principle, moral and political, once conceived and held up to the angry passions of men, will never be obliterated, and every new irritation will mark it deeper and deeper." But Jefferson was unambiguously on the slavery side of the question, agreeing with the Southerners that Congress had no right to legislate matters of the states. Jefferson, ever the champion of exile for free Black people, convinced himself that slaves trafficked to Missouri would be happier, saying, "The secession of that kind of property, for so it misnamed, is a bagatelle which would not cost me a second thought if in any way a general emancipation and expatriation could be effected. But as it is, we have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is one scale and self preservation in the other. Of one thing I am certain, that as the passage of slaves from one state to another would not make a slave of a single human being who would not be so without it, so their diffusion over a great surface would make them individually happier. So he felt that if they moved to Missouri, the slaves would be happier. He finished the letter by absolving himself and his entire generation and dismissing his juniors, saying, "I regret that I am now to die in the belief that the useless sacrifice of themselves by this generation of 1776 to acquire self-government and happiness to their country is to be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passions of their sons." During all this time, kidnapped Africans have been smuggled into American seaports, especially via Jean Lafitte, the pirate privateer operator of in the Gulf of Mexico. With Napoleon gone and the British once again allies, the U.S. Navy concentrated on eradicating piracy. The milestone in the closing of the African slave trade was the 1819 Act to protect the commerce of the United States and punish the crime of piracy, which also was amended in 1820 to include the foreign slave trade as piracy, a crime carrying the death penalty. The ruling families of South Carolina saw that as an insult, but the slave owners of Virginia liked it, and they were in charge in Washington. And remember, the slave owners in Virginia liked it because they could breed domestic slaves. So while it was illegal to traffic more slaves from Africa, it was not illegal to breed slaves in Virginia or Maryland and sell them south. The domestic slave trade was going full tilt. Finally, the competition from African importations was gone. With the British Navy no longer harassing American ships, they were now a safe, legal ocean corridor for shipping slaves south in the domestic slave trade. The legally mandated domestication of the slave trade put a sharp cap on how fast plantations could expand. They could only grow as fast as the enslaved women of the South could turn out babies. The demand was intense. Over the next 20 years, as the power looms of Lancashire sucked up all the cotton that the South could grow, enslaved wombs were not merely sources of local enrichment, but were also suppliers in a global system of agricultural input, industrial output, and financial expansion. How well or how harshly to treat an enslaved mother was a principal issue in plantation management, affecting as it did the survivability of children. Those farmers more inclined to long term profit from increase or breeding than to the shorter term profit from labor were obliged to promote their health and render them prolific, as one writer put it. In a now notorious letter of January 17th, 1819, that was in another era routinely ignored by Jefferson's biographers, the 76-year-old ex president, plagued by debt and frustrated by the death in infancy of some of his human capital, emphasized urgently that producing children was a specialized occupation on par with other skills enslaved laborers might have. He said, "The loss of 5 little ones in 4 years induces me to fear that the overseers do not permit the women to devote as much time as is necessary to the care of their children, that they view their labor as the first object of the raising, their children as secondary. I consider the labor of a breeding woman as no object, and that a child raised every 2 years is of more profit than the crop of the best laboring man. I must pray you to inculcate upon the overseers that it is not their labor, but their increase, their womb, which is the first consideration with us." By this time, the interstate slave trade that Jefferson had done so much to facilitate was taking off, and the market it created for his slaves' increase offered the only hope for escaping his crushing burden of debt. In telling the overseer to ease off on hard labor for breeding women, Jefferson laid out the financial trade off that careful farm managers had to consider in deciding how to apply their female labor. How much time women should spend working the land versus how much to spend reproducing. This could involve calculations against market prices for crops. Higher prices meant more field labor, lower prices, more birth labor. Or, since poor land required more labor to be applied, it could mean balancing the fertility of a patch of land against the fertility of an enslaved woman. Jefferson's one child every 2 years quota was it. It should be noted, not the worst, was an even more rapacious owner could insist on faster breeding. Martha Jackson, born in 1850 and interviewed in Livingston, Alabama, recalled her auntie was a breeder woman who brought in children every 12 months, just like a cow bringing in a calf. Indeed, Jefferson had established the 2-year limit experimentally because, as previously noted, his own frail wife had died at the age of 33 from 6 pregnancies in less than 10 years, her health growing visibly worse with each confinement. Not that was unusual, white or black. Women commonly were pregnant that often, and not and they not infrequently died during and especially after childbirth. One might wonder if the reproductive ability of enslaved women was so valuable, why did they constantly sell for lower prices than men? Perhaps because women weakened from the repeated pregnancy were less productive in the field, but also because women were a riskier purchase, often dying in their 20s because of the prevailing unsanitary methods of childbirth were so deadly. In testimony during the 1839 court case in Warren County, Mississippi, about a farm at which the policy is not to make large crops but to raise young Negroes, Tobias Stevens suggested rating breeding women at half a hand, writes Christopher Morris. Tobias Stevens wrote, if breeding women are worked hard on the hills, it is likely to produce abortion and sickness. A witness for the plaintiff thought the current administrator had not managed the plantation very well and offered evidence his observation of women working in the fields. Concern for the women's well being was not the issue in the court case, needless to say. What was being decided was the financial acumen of the manager. Jefferson was nothing if not consistent in his promotion of a 2-year cycle of commercial human production. In a letter dated June 30th, 1820, to John Wales Epps, in the course of justifying a plan to sell off 20 enslaved people and families rather than only laboring men, he discussed his captives in terms otherwise applicable to livestock management. As per the use of the verb stocking, I know no error more consuming to an estate than that of stocking farms with men almost exclusively, Jefferson wrote. I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm. What she produces is an addition to the capital, while his labors disappear in mere consumption. What he's saying is that he can leverage the birth of a child and get more money. Whereas as that man ages and his labor and body are used up, he becomes less valuable. In addition to the capital, the variant word capitalism had not yet been coined, but the term capital had remained in Jefferson's lexicon 28 years after his 4% letter to Washington, and it still applied to slaves. Jefferson understood clearly how the concept of capital applied to his society. Capital is money that makes more money, and slaves were property who made more property, including more slaves. Who could be used to money? Who could be used as money when the need arose? It was therefore advisable to stock a farm with enslaved women who could breed about every 2 years, and in doing so would make a small annuum per capita growth target, as Jefferson had identified in his 1792 letter to Washington. Epps, the recipient of Jefferson's letter, was the recently retired U.S. Senator from Virginia and was Jefferson's son in law, having been married to Jefferson's daughter, Maria, or Mary, or Patsy, who was his first cousin. Maria had died in childbirth related to complications 16 years before, in 1804, as her mother Martha, or Patty Wales Jefferson, had died from childbirth before her, and as her grandmother had died after giving birth to her mother. So Jefferson had a long history of women that died during this childbirth thing because of the unsanitary conditions, even though these were white women. As Martha's confinement approached, Jefferson perhaps failed to reassure the frightened 24-year-old when he wrote her from the White House, "You are prepared to meet it, childbirth, with courage, I hope. Some female friend of your mama's, I forget whom, used to say it was no more than a jog of the elbow." Maria knew better, having watched her mother die and having given birth twice already. She gave birth in February and died in April. The bereaved Epps took up with a woman who may also have been Jefferson's daughter, at least according to present day Hemings family oral tradition and local belief. By the time Jefferson wrote his addition to capital letter, Epps was cohabitating with Betsy Hemings, whom Jefferson had given to Epps and Maria as a wedding present. If she was indeed Jefferson's daughter, she would thus have been the deceased Maria's half sister, making a creepy parallel about the way her Aunt Sally had been the deceased Martha Wales' half sister. All the above named, except for Jefferson himself, were descended from John Wales. After Epps died, Betsy Hemings was never sold, and she was buried alongside him. Whoever Betsy Hemings' father was, the Hemings had provided the Wales Jefferson family with 3 generations of what Madison Hemings, Sally's son, referred to as concubine in a March 13th, 1873 interview in the Pike County, Ohio Republican, in which he declared Jefferson to have been his father, and which is our only record of his thoughts. Jefferson died on the same day as John Adams, on the mystically suggested date of July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the date of the Declaration. His unpopularity as president had begun to fade with the growth of a patriotic cult around the founding fathers, fueled by Henry Clay's popular mythologizing discourse. Jefferson had desperately hoped to grow his way out of debt that tormented him in his final years. Like many Southern planters, he failed. When he died, the boom in Virginia born slaves was only starting to get underway. William Barry, who visited Monticello in 1832, wrote, "All is dilapidation and ruin. Most of the gadgetry, maps, and fixtures in the interior of present day Monticello that is so impressively maintained by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation is a loving work of collection, restoration, and reimagination." So it's all fake. Thomas Jefferson's things were sold off, as were all his slaves, but the ones descended from Betty Hemmings. Among the other things, that is, the shrine that is present day Monticello is a well kept window into the practice of slavery, complete with, as of 2015, rebuilt slave cabins. Lucy Cottrell was 15 years old on January 15th, 1827, when she was put on the auction block. One of 140 people sold alongside the farm implements, crops, and livestock of Monticello. She was bought together with her mother Dolly by the German born University of Virginia modern languages professor George Blatterman, who had been vetted by Jefferson before being hired. Blatterman was booted from the faculty in 1840 for horsewhipping his wife twice in a single week, once on the public road. It was around 1845 that the family had a daguerreotype made of Blatterman's granddaughter, Charlotte, in the arms of the woman who attended her, making Cottrell one of the first African Americans to have been the subject of a portrait photograph. After Blatterman died, his widow took Lucy and Dolly to Maysville, Kentucky around 1850, where she freed them 5 years later. By the time Monticello was liquidated, the self reproducing capital represented by slaves was about to be subjected to a new kind of profit extracting process unknown in Jefferson's generation. Louisiana, the commercial giant of the South, created a new way of financing plantation agriculture, the property bank. After the Louisiana legislature chartered a bank called the Consolidated Association of Planters of Louisiana in 1827, capitalized at $2 million, the bank began to bundle mortgages, largely collateralized, as were most Southern mortgages, by slaves, who thus made up a large part of the property in the property bank. Shored up by a guarantee from the state of Louisiana, the bank began to sell bonds in the financial capitals of the North and in England and in Europe. So although the North was not as much of a slave state, and in England it was outlawed, and in Europe they had these high-minded ideals, they bought the slave bonds. Edward E. Baptist, who calls attention to this securitization process, writes that a British bank could now sell a completely commodified slave, not a particular individual who could die or run away, but a bond that was the right to a one slave sized slice of pie made from the income of thousands of slaves. Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi all followed suit. When Jefferson took office in 1801, the African slave trade was still open. When Monroe left office in 1825, that trade was a distant memory, and the domestic slave trade in African Americans was on the verge of its great boom era. Managing that transition was one of the achievements, if one wishes to regard it as such, of the Virginia dynasty. The liquidation of Monticello, in which Lucy and the others were sold, was supervised by Jefferson's eldest grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, with the help of his brother in law, Nicholas P. Trist, a young Virginia born Louisiana sugar planter who had married Jefferson's granddaughter, Virginia Jefferson Randolph. We will meet Mr. Trist again. As the center of population gravity shifted westward, the stage was set for the change from a political machine based in Virginia to one with roots in Tennessee. Intending to follow James Monroe as the fourth consecutive Jeffersonian president, Andrew Jackson won the popular vote and a plurality of the electoral vote in the 1824 presidential election. But it was taken from him by John Quincy Adams in what Jacksonians branded as the corrupt bargain. For the backroom agreement Adams was alleged to have made to appoint the ambitious Henry Clay to the post of Secretary of State in exchange for his electors. Appointing Clay doomed Adams' presidency from the start. Enraged at the outcome of the election, Jackson declined Adams' invitation to serve as Secretary of War. Instead, with a group of advisors that included the New York professional politician Martin Van Buren and communications magnate in the making, Amos Kendall, he built a powerful political machine that reshaped the nation and trained its political firepower on Adams, whose every initiative was blocked in Congress. The next 4 years was a full-time campaign for a Jackson presidency. Sound familiar? Do we know of any presidents today that ran a full-on 4-year campaign because they lost the election? Adams' career had been marked by his distaste for political parties, and he did not have a political organization. The Jacksonians had a populist platform, land and gold. Adams, a cosmopolitan, Puritan descended intellectual who spoke the language of diplomacy in erudite phrases laden with classical references, did not have the popular touch. Wanted a federal government that would make infrastructural improvements and improve education. But Jackson, a ruffian who spoke the plain language of a warrior, wanted a weak federal government that would distribute as much former Indian land and as much specie as possible to individuals in an expanding slave society. Adams thought Jackson a barbarian who could not write a sentence of grammar and hardly could spell his own name. But he learned a rough lesson at Jackson's hands about communicating with the public. At a time when newcomers with no inherent wealth were increasing the free population faster than established families could hand down wealth, Jackson's party harnessed the political power of this new force. Presidential candidates were still expected to remain somewhat aloof from campaigning, though candidates for lower offices showed no such restraint and traveled a lively circuit of political barbecues. Jackson spent the next 4 years running for president while pretending not to, burnishing his heroic aura. The Port Gibson, Mississippi correspondent of November 3rd, 1827, reported his words as follows: I have saved your women and children from the tomahawk and scalping knife. I have protected your great emporium from flames and from British myriad minions. And when all other resources failed, have obtained and annexed from your state an extensive domain, adding wealth and numbers to your restricted limits. The Jacksonians assembled what became the Democratic Party with institutional continuity to the one we now have today, whose bases were in Nashville in the South and New York City in the North. John C. Calhoun, who had been the vice president under Adams, switched sides and ran with Jackson, who was elected president by a landslide in 1828. As Jackson had done in the 1824 elections and would do so again in 1832, he carried every county in Mississippi. And that's the end of tonight's reading. But as you can see, there are a lot of parallels between that political time and this political time that we're living in. These white people call for a strong man. They don't want the intellectual elite of their ethnicity to run their country. They want a strong man. They want the base level, I hate black people, strong man to run their country. They don't want eloquence and dignity. They don't want someone that actually speaks for all the people. They want someone that speaks their language. They want the red meat. They want to be told that they're the greatest, that they're going to be taken care of, and that everybody else can go to hell. And they've always wanted that. They've wanted that since the beginning of this country, and they continue to want that, not recognizing that we are a country of immigrants and not just white immigrants. We're a multicultural country. Well, that's all I have for tonight. I will be back on Thursday reading from Niggas to Gods at 9 p.m. If you are interested in part 2, which got taken down by YouTube, please send me an email to revolutionarymatron@gmail.com. The email link is in my bio. I appreciate KW Don 7 for listening. I know that Koku is listening, Bawana Haguziki is listening, Anthony McPhail is listening, The Forecast Radio is listening. Manning for Mayor is listening. Sister Ra and the elders are listening, and so many others. I value each and every one of you for spending this time with me. I thank you and I appreciate you. And remember to tune in to all the shows on KWAZ Radio, which includes the Bitter Medicine Shoot the Breeze podcast, Forecast Radios, The Forecast, Consider Cheek Show, the Black Business Network's Brother Bakari, his show, the Pro-Black Perspective with Oni Tase, and D Webb's The Harsh Reality Podcast. Thank each and every one of you for being here, and I will see you next time. Peace, guys.